Last week I shared a little bit about my trips to El Salvador on human rights pilgrimages and some of what we learned. And today I want to share something that happened on my first trip to El Salvador. I saw a picture that has stayed with me. It was not a regular framed, tangible picture. It was a thing that sometimes happens when my prayer life gets particularly intense, a thing that is just short of a vision, where I'm aware of the world around me and connected to reality, and I can have a conversation and all that, but I also see a picture appear in front of me in the middle of everything else. And on the Sunday that we went to church on that first trip, I was standing in the parking lot before church, and I saw a picture, a circle of all sorts of people with a flame-like, dove-like something in the middle that was clearly the Holy Spirit. And everyone was so incredibly joyful and dancing and singing and just alive. And there was plenty of room left in the circle. It was a very open kind of circle, visibly so. And the Spirit and the people said to me, "Join us!" And I stood there in the parking lot and I said, "I don't know how." So the Spirit returned to her dancing, and I returned to the rest of the world. But the picture didn't leave me, and neither did the depth of my response. I don't know how. I'm not that free. The first time that the prodigal story came around after I returned from that first trip to El Salvador, it made me wonder, might the older son have also felt that stuck, that trapped, that befuddled? Was it all resentment about the stuff, or was there an underlying sense that despite everything, the younger son had somehow learned something on his journeys that was worth having? Did he look at the younger son's freedom to dance and sing and be that joyful over just having come home, and envy the freedom and joy that he saw? And did he really want the fatted calf for himself, or was he mostly looking for a way to say, "I don't know how to accept your invitation. I want to, but I don't know how"? What if his objection here isn't actually, "You never gave me anything, but I have worked like a slave for you all these years"? And what if the father's response to that statement is simply, "Why? Why have you worked yourself to the bone to fulfill the letter of every command, when all I wanted was for you to join the family and share in every joy and sorrow"? What if the burden was never yours to bear alone in the first place? I still find myself moved and convicted by these questions. And yet this time through the lectionary, I also find myself standing before that picture and this story with a new wondering. What has the cost been of the last few years of their lives for all of them? Not just what is the cost in money, not just what is the fatted calf cost, or what does the squandered inheritance cost. The story tells us that it cost the younger son pretty much everything to come back home. Not until his money was gone did he even consider it, but still he didn't start back home until he also had let go of everything he thought he knew about himself and his place in the world. Which is not surprising. Jesus and the martyrs and the saints from the first days of Jesus' ministry to modern saints like Oscar Romero and Dietrich Bonhoeffer have all said that following Jesus will cost us everything. But what did it cost the father and the older son to turn their worlds upside down? To liquidate half the family property and lose a third of the family workforce in the bargain? What did it cost them in their hearts? Has the older son been watching his father pine away for the younger son? Is the older son afraid not just of living extravagantly, but of loving extravagantly? Why doesn't the older son seem to know how to join in the party? Why is it that his feet seem stuck to the ground? Maybe he's exactly the stick in the mud that we've always been taught. Or maybe he's just been hurt one too many times. What have the last few years cost the father and the older son in the way of grief, I wonder? What has the older son learned to do to protect his own heart? I wonder if one of the things he has learned is what vulnerability researcher Brené Brown calls foreboding joy. Foreboding joy is that thing that we sometimes do when a hard or unfair comes to an end or lightens a little bit, and instead of taking a deep breath and embracing the opportunity for joy and pleasure, we get scared of the hard thing coming back. Your cancer is in remission, worry about it coming back. Your house is finally clean, sigh about how quickly that will change. Someone told a funny story at your best friend's funeral and you had a moment to laugh. Feel guilty about that. Feel guilty that you remembered her with joy. Foreboding joy is always, always, always waiting for another shoe to drop, no matter how many shoes we have already seen fall. Foreboding joy protects us from the pain of being disappointed when things don't stay as good as they seem like they are at this moment. Or at least that's what it tells us it will do. But it often doesn't work as well as we think it will. In small doses, it can be an adequate and even a good coping mechanism. It helps us to be responsible. But the good news of the gospel of Jesus Christ is so, so much more than just foreboding joy. And if we aren't careful, a habit of foreboding joy can leave us with a lifetime of regret for the good things we never took the risk of saying yes to. Thankfully, noticing foreboding joy is itself the first step in dealing with and responding to foreboding joy, and not giving it the reins to our life. That first step is just to notice it and to name it. There is a power in naming. And naming gives us choices about how to respond to the thing that we have now identified, so that we can get curious about what is happening, why we are experiencing foreboding joy, why we are afraid to be happy, to want things, to hope for things. And then we grieve. Once we've identified what we need to grieve, we grieve. And grief, going through grief, becomes part of the journey of how we get past foreboding joy and into engaging joy and receiving joy. Then we can connect with other people. Then we can dig in and get grateful, not for the thing that caused us grief necessarily. We may or may not ever come to be grateful for the thing that caused us grief, and we don't have to be. But we can dig down and find the things for which we can be grateful. And yet I want to point out that that's coming later in the process. If it comes easy for you, great. It can come early in the process. But I think it's helpful to be reminded that that doesn't have to be step 1. That can be step 5. Gratitude helps us to ease back into joy. But it's not a switch that we are responsible for flicking all the time. It's okay if it takes us some time to name things, to grieve things, to identify what's going on before we can take a deep breath and say, okay, now what can I be grateful for? It's okay if some days gratitude is harder than others. But gratitude eventually has to come to help us to take a step back into joy. These practices open the door for healing, open the door for joy to return, for joy eventually to be given the reins to our life. Going through the painful parts, though, is the only way we get free of the ways that they try to pin us to the ground. We don't get resurrection without death. We don't get Easter without Good Friday. And we do get to stay in that moment and cry and grieve and make space for that. Tears actually lighten the load. They start to break up physically. They start to break up the knots in our chest and release our muscles to be able to do more than clench. Our Easter hope doesn't make human grief unchristian. That's a line from our prayer book, and it's a line from the directions for doing a funeral, and yet it is one of my very favorite lines in the entire prayer book, even though it's a line never meant to be read out loud. Until we can face the sorrow and call it by its name, we limit our ability to join in on joy. And we lose sight of the joy, the resurrection, being the goal. The cross is what it costs to get there, but the cross itself is not the end point. The cross itself is not the goal. The empty tomb, the new life of resurrection, that's where we're headed. And just as we can't get there without going through the cross, we also can't open our hands wide enough to grab onto that new life, that Easter love, that Easter joy, if our hands are still clutching the nails. We have to let go of the nails that caused the pain. It's hard work. You wouldn't think it would be that hard to pry your fingers off of something, but it's hard work to learn to loosen our grip, to breathe again, to learn to laugh again, to learn to dance again, or maybe to learn it for the first time. Trauma is real and it matters. And we are, all of us together, beginning just now to emerge from a community trauma that still isn't over. And most of us are emerging with our hands clutched full of other griefs and traumas that have been added in the last couple of years, beyond the fact of the pandemic itself. If the trauma of the cross were the last word for us as Christians, then we of all people would be most to be pitied, as the Apostle Paul would say. But God's promise is that the trauma doesn't get the last word. We don't have to stand forever stuck in a parking lot or out in the field, watching others share in the dance of joy. We just have to pick up one foot at a time, even if it is picking up one foot slowly and intentionally putting it back down. But anyone in a 12-step program will tell you the same thing, one day at a time, one step at a time. You don't have to know right away how you'll get all the way there, but it works if you work it, so keep coming back. You can make your path the same way others have made theirs, one stumble at a time. Because as presiding Bishop Michael Curry said a few years ago in his Easter message, death does not have the last word. Hatred does not have the last word. Violence does not have the last word. Bigotry does not have the last word. Sin, evil does not have the last word. The last word is God, and God is love. I hope you'll join us after worship, or if you are worshiping from home or elsewhere, I hope you'll watch the e-news for the recording of the program after church. We have, each of us and all of us together, very real griefs and losses, and they need to be named. The only way we break the spell holding our feet to the ground is to name the powers that are holding us back, and to let ourselves be changed as we name also that love is greater than all those powers combined. And so we can take the risk ourselves of love, of joy, of celebration. Amen.